everybody, how are we doing? We get started here with some stats. What do we have today? What stats do we have? Maybe my contacts will come in this weekend, you never know. Will I get contacts? Will I be able to see? You know, the glasses have been doing pretty good. My vision's pretty darn horrible. Yet, I can see with glasses. Maybe that's a sign. Mirror image trying to straighten this out, all sparkly. Hey, Noel, good morning. Let's throw you some U-Bot points. We got to make some new levels. I haven't been, maybe it's allergies or something. I've been congested like since October, it seems. It's just a small little, like, want to be 100% again. What do we have for work? What work do we have? What work do you want to do, Noel? What work do you want to do? What work do we have? Chat over here. Car work done. Someone's getting the car work done, I know. Streaming over there. Bring this over here. There we go. We're getting work done. Okay, let's go to 201. And projects are getting turned in slowly but surely. And we do have chapter 16 due tonight. So we might do all chapter 16 homework right now. Assignment manager. Chapter 16 homework sounds good to me. Reviewing the concepts from it, telling you how to do it. Sounds like a good idea. Not that hard. I finished the homework, but trying to finish the project. Yeah, send me straight enough condition. Here, I'll talk about that to start. Okay, it's straight enough. We'll do conditions of regression to start. We'll cover Braden. Good to see you. We're going to do the chapter 16 homework coming up here in a second. But right now, let's do the full conditions for, and we'll throw you some points, Braden. Good to see you. Oh, yeah, Braden, I met you, right? Was it Braden? Yeah, I did meet Braden. So it's, yeah, you came by, you're like, I'm Braden. I was like, hey! I was like, who? Yeah, Braden, online. Yeah, so good. Took me anytime. It's awesome to meet people. I'm like, I know you. Stats 1, project, regression, conditions. I know the picture right there. That's the thing is I'm like, wait, oh, Braden. Let's do this. So regression conditions need to be looked at the following way. The conditions are QQ straight enough, no outliers, plot doesn't thicken. QQ stands for two quantitative variables. Quantitative variables. I don't know how to spell things. Quantitative variables. You can call it two quantitative variables. Condition straight enough, no outliers, and plot doesn't thicken. So these are the four conditions right here. Well, I do play a lot of video games. I like that, Braden. I like that. So yeah, no, I like that. Like you play some online games, you're like, oh, dude, what's up? It's like, hey. No, that's cool. That's the way I feel sometimes too. It's like I'll meet my students and they'll be like, hey, I'm so-and-so. And I'll be like, oh yeah, we talk a lot. And they'll be like, well, yeah, online. So this is going to disappear here. Oh, we need more space than this. We're going to need more space. More room for activities. Really? You going to do that to me? There we go. There we go. There we go. There we go. Okay. So we've got whether it passes or fails the condition. So we have whether it passes or fails. This will be pass, and this will be fail. So if it fails the QQ, it would look something like a mosaic plot, because you'd have categorical variables. It would look like side-by-side box plots, because you'd have a categorical X, quantitative Y. Or it could look like a histogram that's univariate by itself. So all of these would fail the QQ because side-by-side box plots are categorical X, quantitative Y. Yeah, and then I'll go into that right here, Noel. You got it. Let's take a look. Because now if it passes QQ, then it has to be X and Y have to be quantitative, which means we probably have a scatter plot. I mean, we should have a scatter plot. You can graph quantitative with scatter plots. So if you pass QQ, it's because both the variables here are quantitative. Where over here, it would be that one's not quantitative. This one right here would not be quantitative. And the Y would be quantitative. And this is just univariate. It's bivariate quantitative. So if you look at the reason this passed, does that make QQ is the easy one, I think, a lot of people get. means two quantitative variables. That's just one quantitative. That's categorical quantitative. That's categorical categorical if you have a mosaic plot. So you have to have two quantitative variables to make a scatter plot and then to fit a line to it. Straight enough, here's how to talk about it. So check out the straight enough section right here and talking about and explaining straight enough. Straight enough means you can fit a line to any data. But when you look at the trend of your points, do they generally have a what? When you look at the trend of your points, and we could do generally because it doesn't have to be perfect, do they generally have a what? Do they generally? So that's not perfect. It's not perfect. You look at it. We'll zoom in on it here a little bit. It's not perfect, but do they generally have a what? Do they generally follow a linear trend? Now, it's not perfect. It's got some weirdness over here. And you could say, you don't have to say this 100% passes. This is perfect. I love it. It's great. You could say, this is mostly good. And come up with your own words because I'm talking about mine right here. So this is mostly good. It has small problems, but I think for the most part, it is straight enough. Does that make sense? So it has small problems, especially towards the end where it starts to dip down below a line of best fit. And I think it's straight enough. It's not the perfectly straight condition. It's the straight enough. So when do we fail the condition? We fail the condition for data that might have something like this right here. And when you fit the line to the data, the line would look something like this right here. And maybe you can always fit a line. So the line can always be fit, but you notice that there's this kind of bend around the line. And that's a big indication that it fails. You can always fit a line to any data, but you want to see that it generally follows a linear pattern. So do these points right here generally follow a linear pattern? Yes. Do these points over here generally follow a linear pattern? No. So, and by linear, once again, you can always add a line to the data. I added the line right here. You can always add a line to any data, but is it a good idea? It's only a good idea. Good to see there, Thomas. It's only a good idea when the data is straight enough. To check the no outliers condition, you simply look at the data and you see, are there no outliers? Well, that would fail. You go over here and you see, are there no outliers? And that would fail due to this right here. So that's going to fail, and this is good because there's no outliers. So the yellow means good in this instance, and the pink means bad. The plot doesn't thicken is checked by doing a residual plot. What happens if it thickens and then thins out randomly? So the plot doesn't thicken means it has about the same thickness throughout. So when you look at a residual plot, this would say, residual is actually over here, residual. So when you look at a residual plot, this is how we check the plot doesn't thicken. Make sure to explain that to somebody. We check the plot doesn't thicken by looking at a residual plot. And it should have about equal thickness throughout. And so Noel said, what happens if it thickens and then thins out randomly? So wait, thickening is its own thing though. Thickening is a totally different condition. So the plot, each of these are separate ideas to check. And the thickening thing is the plot doesn't thicken, which is we look at the residual plot and we see it has about the same thickness throughout. This is the plot doesn't thicken. This is there are no outliers. The key thing here, no outliers. No outliers. Straight enough, and two quantitative variables. Hey, Clay, we have the full videos on the project. We're talking about the conditions for regression, so make sure to write full responses here. And then plot thickening, you said what happens if it thickens out and then randomly and then thins? So if it thickens, so with this graphic I just drew pass or fail because it thickens and then thins out. Would this graphic pass or fail? It would fail. Great job, Aiden, right there, because it gets thicker and thinner. So it would fail because the residual plot. So each of these conditions are checked separately. So if you had a plot right here, like we could do one, we'll open up some data and go over here. We get analyze fit y by x, and we take like special defense, explaining special attack, we drop it in, and I can already see if I fit them all to this, there's gonna be what problems here. I can already tell you. You can see it. The big problem here is what? And we can do the plot residuals. Check out the video, I'll go a little slower through this. I don't see as big a problem down there on that, but Yeah, there's outliers. You can highlight your outliers by clicking on them and going to colors and adding in a color right there, a light purple, and then go to markers. And you don't have to do these things. It's just kind of neat because now you can see where they're at. And then the majority of the plot, it really doesn't get much thicker or thinner. I'm zooming in so I can look at this. Notice that it has about the same thickness throughout. Good morning, Bailey. Good to see you there. We're going to do some chapter 16 homework next, I believe. And the majority of the plot has about the same thickness. I removed the outliers for the moment, just so we could look at the vast majority of the plot has about the same thickness throughout. And we are looking at, once again, the residual plot for this to say the residual plot doesn't thicken. So once again, make sure to check out what we just did, this full section right here, which is marked in the video on checking the regression conditions. QQ, straight enough, no outliers, plot doesn't thicken. And we have examples of passing and failing. And we did for the first 10 minutes here and just explaining it all. So now it is time for chapter 16 homework. Let's do this. Statue 1, chapter 16. So we can say it has the same thickness, but what happens if it does not? If the thickness goes in and out, then we say it fails the plot thickens condition because the residual plot shows uneven spread of data. The plot gets thicker and thinner in the residual plot, showing differences in strengths. Remember, don't write exactly what I write. Don't write exactly what I write. Think of your ways of talking about it and understanding the condition and interpreting it to the reader. So good questions, Noel. Let's throw you some points. And here we are on chapter 16 homework. Question 1. Good, really good questions. Like, you have to understand the conditions, be able to interpret them to the readers. Very important right there. So let's do this first question. Here we go. Once again, you're going to see the answers. What if I change your words to Spanish to 7? No bueno, solamente hablo español este día hoy, porque nosotros aquí. Mi español es no bueno. Okay. Which of the following is true? If false, explain briefly. A p-value of 0.01 means the null hypothesis is false. Well, we either what or what the null. I'm not even looking at their answers. We either what or what the null. We either what or what the null. Don't even worry about their answers. Don't look at the answers. Don't look at reject or not reject. Boom, know that right there. Nice job. 5,000 points. We reject or do not reject. So when the p-value is low, you reject the null. We don't know the null is false when the p-value is low. We would probably have evidence for the alternative because the low p-value means what we saw was unlikely given the null is true. So we'd probably reject the null. So this p-value provides evidence against the null but doesn't show it's false. That's probably going to be it right there. Yeah. Once again, don't look at their answers. A p-value of 0.01 means that the null hypothesis has a 0.01 chance of being true. We see this in the notes. I might bring up the notes. P-values are conditional probabilities. Because if I tell you, if I say to you, where are you? There we go. If I say I can run a 5-minute mile, what would you expect to see me do? If the null hypothesis is Brian can run a 5-minute mile, which is not true these days. If the null hypothesis, not that the null is false, what would you expect me to do if the null is true? You'd expect to see me, that's perfect answer right there. You'd expect to see me run a 5-minute mile. So if you saw me run a mile in 5:02, do you think you'd reject the null? Do you think you'd be like, I think, Brian, you're a liar. I reject the null. Would you reject the null? Just think normally how normal people are, not very mean people. I wouldn't reject. You'd be like, I saw him do a 5:02 mile. Now, that's not the most probable thing. The most probable thing is to see Brian run a 5-minute mile. So what the p-value tells us, if you think Brian is slower than 5 minutes. That means you'd go to where you landed at the result. We'll do the result here in blue, and you would shade to what side of it. So that would be mean, I agree. You would shade to what side of the result. If you're doing, you think Brian is slower than 5 minutes. Since you're doing slower to do the p-value on this test, this would be a greater than test, and you'd shade to the right of it. Great job, Braden, right there. So what you'd be saying here, this p-value tells us that if I am a 5-minute mile runner, You saw if this p-value is something, we're just making up numbers. If this p-value is something like 40%, you saw something a 5-minute mile runner would do 40% of the time. Does that make sense? Like running 5:02 or slower is something a 5-minute mile runner would do 40% of the time. So it's a probable result. But if you saw me run my mile in 15 minutes and 2 seconds, then the p-value would be much wetter. If you saw me do it in 15 minutes and 2 seconds, the p-value would be way, way wetter. Way, 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 way wetter. Smaller, good guess, smaller, because this is a what probable result over here at 15. So it'd be, see, no worries, we're throwing extra points. Don't worry if you get it wrong. It'd be way smaller because the p-value tells us just what we saw was probable. Do you think it's probable for a 5-minute mile runner to run their miles in 15 minutes? This is the observed results. This is, we observed Brian doing it in 15 minutes. So this is what we observe. And the p-value over here, P is basically equal to 0. Someone says, I'm a 5-minute mile runner, and then they try their best and do 15:02. You'd be like, what I just saw is not really possible given you're a 5-minute mile runner. They're like, no, it could happen like 1 in a billion times. And you're like, I don't think this is the 1 in a billion occurrence. I reject. So there's a p-value kind of, so what a p-value tells us is it tells us if what we saw was likely given the null is true. I'll do one more example, and it's, you gotta do a few of them hopefully, and then it clicks. So remember, we assume the null is true, and then we ask, is what I saw likely? Let me write this down so people can read it. P-values are 1, assume null is true, because the null is assumed to be true unless evidence otherwise. 2, gives the probability of what we saw given the null is true. Okay, so when would you have a low p-value? Your friend tells you the null hypothesis. I'm going to cheat and grab my notation over here. Your friend, really? Your friend tells you that they are the best pizza maker in the world. So your friend tells you, I am the best pizza maker in the world. And with them telling you they are the best pizza maker in the world, what would you expect? When they make you a pizza, what? If your friend tells you they are the best pizza maker in the world, if they made you a pizza, what would you expect? You expect the best pizza, right? So when your friend makes you this pizza down here, and we already did this one in class a little bit. So now they get a Ritz cracker. Here's a Ritz cracker. And on that Ritz cracker, they put some mustard, because they say it's really good with mustard. And then they put little tiny flakes of pepperoni. And they say this is the best pizza right here. And then they do some shake Parmesan cheese on it. Like shake Parmesan cheese. Where's that shake Parmesan cheese? Here it is. They shake some Parmesan cheese on it. And they say, oh my gosh. This is criminal, right? You just think, would you reject the null then? The null is that they're the best pizza maker in the world. The null is that they're the best pizza maker in the world. Do you think you reject that null? Put some ketchup too. Now you're asking for the supreme. They just douse some, they do that little, I reject this null. This is ridiculous. So think about this. What you saw there was a likely result given they're the best pizza maker in the world, or an unlikely result? Don't even worry about p-values right now. Just tell me. What you saw right there was a likely thing given that they're the best pizza maker in the world. That was a likely thing to see, or an unlikely? So unlikely means probability is what? Like if I say it's unlikely to rain today, probability is what? So if I say it's unlikely to rain today, probability is what? High or low? If I say it's low. And so what a p-value tells us is we assume the null is true. We assume, hey, my friend's the best pizza maker in the world. And then we look at what occurs and we say, is that likely given the null is true? So the p-value is conditional on the null being true, and then we try to figure out, is the observed likely or unlikely given the null is true? And if we see something unlikely given the null is true, we reject the null because we have evidence the null is not true, because this is evidence your friend is not the best pizza maker in the world. Does that make sense? I hope this example also kind of cements it. Then we do it with statistical notation, all that fun jazz, but I think it's more fun to not talk stats. Talk like, you know, what you would normally do. You'd be like, I think I saw something that wouldn't be true if you're the best pizza maker. I have evidence. It's highly unlikely you're making the best pizzas with that. Yeah, and it's, I think sometimes it just kind of clicks one day. I've had people tell me that. So the p-value of this means the null hypothesis has a chance to true. Nope. They just say that it's not the probability the null is true. It's a conditional probability on what we saw given the null is true. So they don't go into enough detail. No. Braden, yeah, give him a nice Hawaiian punch. My friends would probably punch me too. Not too hard, but they would be like, dude, what are you doing? You invite me over for this? Come on, man. Probably how I make pizza. A p-value of, I'm that friend. A p-value of 0.01 is evidence against the null. Yeah, and I don't like the way they phrase this. I prefer to say a p-value, and I'm looking for it, is evidence against the null, but it's evidence for what? It's evidence to reject the null, but it's evidence for the what? A low p-value will allow you to reject the null. When the p-value is low, reject the null. Write that down. But it's evidence for the what? It is evidence to reject the null, meaning we have evidence for the, because you need evidence to reject the null to have evidence for the alternative. The answers aren't on the screen over here. I'd say this is mostly true. Doesn't prove. Prove is a bad word in this class. We don't like prove, cause, or accept. I need to put prove in there too, but we don't like prove, cause, or accept. Yeah, it's, low p-values are evidence to reject the null. Evidence for the alternative. Thank you, Mubot. A p-value of 0.01 means we should definitely reject the null. When do we reject the null? And this is a very important thing. You have to know this. This is a huge note. When do we reject the null? And I see the answer behind my head over here. When do we reject the null? Don't read their answers. When do we reject the null? Because the knowledge will help you solve it. P-value is low. And when is p-value low enough? Alternative. Low p. How low does p-value have to be? To reject the null, the p-value has to be lower than what? Which means when we reject the null, we're saying we have evidence for alternative. Kind of 0.05. Less than 0.05 because 0.05 is what we usually assume to be alpha. Unless otherwise stated, alpha is 0.05, which is the significance level. So significance level means you're setting a bar and you're saying alpha's here, and if p-value goes below it, we reject the null. I wanted it to let me move the p-value. But whatever your p-value is, this is the do not reject, this is not reject, and this is the reject down here. And wherever you set your alpha, if you put your alpha to like 0.05, then if your p-value, really, oh man, can I erase? There we go. If your p-value goes below alpha, you reject the null. So if the p-value is below, not at, but below alpha. So unless otherwise stated, and alpha is 0.05 unless otherwise stated, your p-value you reject when it's below alpha. So the question is going to say that. It's going to say we reject when the p-value is below alpha. So we'd probably reject because usually alpha 0.05. Whether p-value provides enough evidence to reject is based on your alpha level. Alpha is the point at which you decide to reject. Really, these are really good questions theoretically, and I know I'm basically giving away all the answers by doing them, but that's why I like to go into more detail and test your knowledge to see if you can explain these things and tell me what a p-value is and what it means. Like, these are good, tricky questions. Let's do the next set. It is better to use a 0.05 alpha or a 0.01 alpha. So alpha is your what? Alpha is literally your type what? Alpha is literally, I know I need one. I'm going to grab one between class, Braden. Alpha is literally your what? Alpha is literally your what? Oh no. Alpha is literally your what? Your alpha, which is your significance level, that's what it is too, is literally your type 1 error rate. It's your false positive rate. 1, 2, A, B, sides of a battery plus minus. Way to memorize it. So it's type 1 error rate. Alpha is literally, what is beta? Beta is what? Beta is what? Beta. Beta is what? Beta is a false negative, type 2 error rate. And the way to memorize this, just think of counting. 1, 2, think of alphabet, A, B, think of sides of a battery, false positive, false negative. Now, in a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. In a type 2 error, the null is false. That's an F, and we fail to reject it. Once again, I'll repeat that again. I'm going to go to the main screen and show you it. In a type 1 error, the null is true and we mistakenly reject it because we're making an error. In a type 2 error, the null is false and we fail to reject it. Thank you to the student who said, hey, you're saying 2 also in a type 2 error. So that's just memorization. They have to think what it means because some of these questions will get into that, like the null is false and you fail to reject it. It's memorization to help with it, to help understand it. So what's the deal with type? As Jerry Seinfeld once said, what's the deal? What's the deal with type 1, type 2 error? I don't know if he ever said that on the show. But it's how much errors the researcher are making. And if you increase your alpha, you increase your type 1 error rate. So you deal with it. That's the way it goes. It's really just up to the researcher how they want to do it. So false just controls your error rates. So the researcher is going to have to figure out how much error they want to make. You can't stop both. If we use an alpha level 0.01, then a p-value of 0.01 is statistically significant. True or false? Help me out with this right here and why. If we use an alpha of 0.01, then a p-value of 0.001 is statistically significant. Yes, no, and why? How would you check this? How would you know the answer to this? When is a p-value statistically significant? So how would you know this? So we know if something is statistically significant. So yes or no, what do you think, Clay? So this is alpha. Alpha equals 0.01. This is p-value. Well, so go into more detail. When is a p-value statistically significant? So Clay, you're on the right track. When is a p-value statistically significant? When is a p-value, or anyone can answer, we'll throw you some points, 5,000 points. When is a p-value statistically significant? Good review question right here. Boom, Bailey got it right there, nice job. P-value less than alpha. So we plug in the numbers, 0.001 less than 0.01. Is this true or false? What do you say? So what do you say? This is significant or is not? Oh, yes. It's connected now, right?
It's not the question you deserve. It's the one you need.
I think he might be a little loud. I'm going to lower his volume a little bit. There we go. It is very, very true. Thank you so much. We need to do that during class today. I'll come up with, be like, we need a Batman review. And then I got to make him go away, it looks like. And then I think he'll reset good. Okay, we got to do that during class. That is very, very true. Got to do the Batman review. Thank you. I forgot we made that. See, I'll forget that we make things. And then I've got, you'd be shocked at the amount of things we made over here. Like, Crash doesn't make as many appearances. So, I like the Muse sign in the sky. That's Jason did that. If we use an alpha level of 0.01, then we reject the null for a p-value of 0.001. We reject the null when the p-value is what? So it says, using an alpha of 0.01, we reject the null if we have a p-value of 0.001. We reject the null when the p-value is what? We reject the null when the p-value is what? These are very good questions. We reject the null when the p-value is what? Write this down if you don't have it. When the p-value is low, or then alpha, reject the null. When the p-value is high, just let it fly. So is this p-value here lower than alpha? You bet. So do you reject the null? You bet. P-value low, reject the null. When the p-value is high, just let the null fly. Let it be, don't reject it. If the p-value is 0.01, we reject the null hypothesis for any alpha level greater than 0.01. That's true. That's just saying you have a higher alpha than p-value, which is kind of the reverse. When the p-value is lower than alpha, reject the null. Very true. They're just really nailing down when p-value low, reject the null. This one right here is a really good review question over 3 big concepts. So we're going to write these down and understand what they are, and it'll help us through. Now, when you get to a question like this, you should have a definition for each one of these. It says, what is the name of the threshold that determines when the null hypothesis is rejected? So one of these I don't cover as much. I'm not a huge fan of it. But think about this. The threshold by which we reject the null is called what? Does anyone know? We talked about it earlier. We made a graphic. This screen right here shows you the threshold by which a p-value must surpass to reject the null. This little screen I made up right here where we do not reject or we reject the threshold, which we can set. We can change this bar. We can go to this bar and be like, I'm going to lower this bar. I'm going to make it lower. It is the alpha level. It's just, you can literally just go in and make a lower bar, making it harder to reject. You see how there's less area on the reject right there? So you could lower your alpha and then it's harder to reject because your p-value would only be down here about 1% of the time by random chance. You could increase your alpha, which means you'll reject more often. So does this make sense right here, Bailey? Like you can take and raise your alpha. People rarely do this. It's considered a bad idea because you're increasing your type 1 error rate. And you would reject more often now because you're increasing, there's more probability you reject. So it is the alpha level. Effect size is the true difference between the hypothesized value and the truth. Type 1 error rate is a false positive when the null is true and we mistakenly reject it. And critical value are the points at which you reject based on, a lot of these things are very similar. I don't like critical values. They won't be on the test. No one talk about those. I don't like them. We don't have to calculate them because we use software. Back in the day, you had to calculate critical values, and my Pearson still thinks we're doing every single problem by hand. So, believe me, if you had to do all these problems by hand, stats would be a lot less fun. It's fun when you get to like work with data and be like, I'm just going to test this. I'm going to look at this. I'm going to run this data. And you just, all you have to do to run data is you just go here and you say, I want to run a test. I'm going to go here. I'm going to make a distribution. I'm going to do that. And look at that. I already got confidence interval. Boom, done. I'd cry daily too. It's, yeah. What is the probability that a test correctly rejects the false null? This is a huge thing to have on a note card. Does anyone know it? A, B, C, or D? Be very careful. We have not mentioned this yet today. So if you're watching this video, if you've heard it today, it's a wrong answer. So that should eliminate it down to 1. We haven't mentioned it today yet. And I think, has Clay already answered it? Nice job, Clay. It is the power of a test. Nice job, Clay. I just looked and I was like, whoa, answer's on the screen already. It is the power of a test. The power of the test is the ability to correctly reject the false null. When would a test be more powerful? Would a test be more powerful if me and LeBron played for 1 second or 1 hour? When would you be able to better tell if who's a better basketball player? If you watch me play LeBron for an hour or a minute or a second, when would you be able to tell who's better? I mean, you'd be able to tell in a second probably. Like I'd have the ball and then he would just like take it and dunk it within a second. And I'd be like, okay, it's pretty obvious. An hour. So if you have a larger sample size, it's easier to reject the false null. The null being LeBron and I are the same skill, which is preposterous. So you could reject the null easier if you take a bigger sample. Does that make sense? Like if you watch us for an hour, you'd be like, watch them for an hour. You gotta be kidding me. So the bigger the sample, the easier it is to reject the false null. Also, alpha. Alpha increases power because alpha makes it easier to reject by literally making it more probable we reject. What is the problem with increasing alpha? If you increase alpha, you're also increasing what? By increasing alpha, you're also increasing what? You are making it easier to reject because you're just raising the bar about how often you reject. But what's the problem with this? Like, I mean, you can do it, but you get a little bit wrong here. Yo, what's up, Andrew? Haven't seen you in a while, Andrew. Good to see you. What's the problem with increasing your type 1 error rate? This is considered bad stats. Bad stats right here. What's the problem with increasing type? What's the problem with increasing alpha? If you don't know, feel free to say, I don't know. What's the problem with increasing alpha? If you increase your alpha, you also increase your type 1 error rate. You make more false positives. So type 1 error rate. It's called type 1 error rate. Good job, Bailey, right there. Type 1 error rate. So this is the type of error. So this is type of error and type error, type 1 error rate. This is the notation for it. And this is the description of it. So it's called usually a false positive. Usually colloquially, like if you go to the hospital and they say you have a disease and you don't, like if they say, oh, you've got the flu, but you don't, we'd call that a what in the hospital? So the null is that you're healthy. And the alternative is that you're sick. So the null is that you're healthy and the alternative is that you're sick. So if they say you have the flu and you don't, we call that a false positive. False positive being, they say, exactly. It's good job, Bailey, right there. So it's a false positive because they're saying you're sick when you're not. That's a type 1 error. Because think about this. The null is true. It is a fact that you're healthy, but they reject the null. Does that make sense? They're going to reject the null. It's a type 1 error. That is true. It's a false positive because you're healthy, but they reject that and they say they have evidence you're sick. A type 2 error is when the null is false. So the null is false, but we failed to reject it. In a type 2 error, it's a false negative because we say you're healthy, but the null is false. The things that mean the same thing are, generally speaking, a lot of people call it a false positive, a type 1 error. These are the general descriptions, but type 1 error is usually considered a false positive. In most instances, most people will describe that as a false positive. A type 1 error always is when the null is true and we reject it. Type 1 error is literally, by the textbook definition, when the null is true and we reject it. A type 2 error is when the null is false and we fail to reject it. And those are T's and F's I'm making right there. Does that make sense? That's the way to memorize it, is to say in a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. In a type 2 error, the null is false and we fail to reject it. So just easiest way to memorize it, I found. And then you just keep saying it and you just keep and just like a little rhyme. So back to the question, it is power of the test. Oh, I didn't finish the graphic we're making. Last thing that controls it is effect size, which effect size is the difference between the null and the truth. Is it easier to tell in a hospital if somebody is sick, if they're coughing, or if they're on a stretcher passed out? And passed out with a temperature, sweating. Yeah, I'll go into that. Yeah, there we go. They're passed out with a temperature and sweating versus someone's like, you're like, so the effect size is the actual distance, like someone healthy or someone sick. If someone's, exactly, so that's a bigger effect, right? Does that make sense if I say the effect of being sick? The person who has the bigger effect, it'd be easier to reject the null that they're healthy and say that they're sick. So when there's a bigger effect size, we have a higher probability of finding out the person's sick. So power is actually 1 minus beta. You should write that down too. And beta is a type 2 error. And beta would be decreased by all of these. So whoa, that was weird. Beta is inversely related to everything I just drew. Beta being type 2 error, alpha being type 1, and sample size and effect size. Yeah, exactly. It's very much. So think of this. If you want to see if a drug works on patients, would you give it to more or less patients? If you want to see if a drug works on patients, would you give it to more or less patients? Like you want to see if the drug actually works. Like you're trying to figure out if there's a real something going on with the drug. You'd give it to more patients. You'd increase your sample size. So by increasing your sample size, the test becomes more powerful. If the drug is like a miracle drug, would that be easier to detect versus a drug that has a small impact on the patients? And what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the what of the drug. Like you think the drug doesn't do anything, but you're trying to see if it has a positive impact. Turns out the drug is a miracle drug and helps everybody. I'm talking about the what of the drug on the far left. So like the what of the drug. Think of the notation we just did over there on the far side. Because then it'd be easier to detect this drug has an impact if it has a big what. Effect size, yes, the effect size of the drug. Like the drug, maybe 20% of people get better generally, but with the drug, 21% of people get better. That might be hard to detect. And you could make errors. You could say, it looks like this drug doesn't help because your random sample might turn out that the people didn't get better, but it turns out the truth is like, and we never really know the truth. We only have estimates of the truth. But if the drug is some sort of like miracle drug and everyone who takes it gets better, you'd be like, everyone in the study got better and they're doing great. And we did a longitudinal study and 20 years out, they're still doing great. So yeah, this drug is a miracle drug. Like penicillin or something like that is like, whoa, this is really great. So if the effect size is huge, it's easy to detect, and we'd be able to reject the null and say we have evidence for the alternative that the drug is very helpful. So the power of the test is the ability for the test to basically find results. When you think of power in that way, I think it helps that power is the ability when you run a test to get results and the ability to not make type 2 errors, because complement of beta, which is type 2 error, is power. Beta is when you fail to find the false null is rejected. When the null is false and you fail to reject it. I hope these are tougher concepts, but I hope this graphic helps. And these are the relationships. And we usually ask questions on the test like, what are the 3 things that impact power? Sample size, alpha level, and effect size. And alpha is not the complement of beta. I think that's even a test question. They are not complements. What is the name for the difference between the null and the truth? Does anyone know this? This is review now. You can get this pretty easily if you know the difference between the null and the truth. I mentioned it just a second ago. Check out, we'll probably go to the next question after this, but what is the difference between the null and the truth? What impacts the 3 things that impact? The 3 things that impact beta are sample size, effect size, and alpha. And then beta is the complement of power. So those 3 things. The 3 things that impact beta are these 3 things. They impact beta. These, if you increase these, they decrease beta. If beta decreases, power increases. So any of these go up. Any 3 of those go up, beta goes down. Beta goes down, power goes up. Good question. So the 3 things that impact beta are sample size, alpha level, and effect size. And beta is the complement of power. So if beta goes down, power goes up. So what is the actual distance between the null and the truth? Yes. Beta is inversely, great job, Bailey. Yeah, and feel free to ask and take screenshots of these or write them down. That's why I try to draw it this way. Beta is directly inverse to any of these. If you have higher sample size, lower beta. Higher alpha, lower beta. Higher effect size, lower beta. You don't control effect size. It just is what is with data. And if beta goes down, power goes up. If sample size goes up, power goes up. If alpha goes up, power goes up. If effect size goes up, power goes up. But you don't control effect size. You control sample size and you control alpha. Best thing to do is control your sample size. And Bailey, you're right. Effect size is the true difference, like a patient who's very sick versus a patient who's not that sick. The effect the patient has. Good work and good review. Okay, it's gonna be a little bit bigger one. Mark it in the notes. Good practice. Homework. Question 6. Let's do it. So with this bank right here, we're going to see what a type 1, type 2 error looks like. And these questions are pretty darn tricky. But what I ask you to do is this every time. In a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. In a type 2 error, the null is false and we failed to reject it. So I want you to look at this answer right here. Could this answer be a possible answer? Could this answer be a possible answer? It says, if the bank made a type 2 error, because they rejected the null. It says they rejected the null and they made a type 2 error. So if you do your sayings, in a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. In a type 2 error, the null is false and we fail to reject it. So the only way you make a type 2 error is when you fail to reject the null. Exactly. If you made a type 2 error, it's because you failed to reject the false null. And if you look, they rejected the null, they rejected the null. We even can tell it's not a type 2 error. It has to be down to one of these 3 answers down here. And the only 2 possible answers are these, because in a type 1 error, they rejected the null. And so it has to be one of these 2, because in a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. That's when you make the type 1 error. So let's see which error they made. They find out that it's 28%. And they rejected the null and believe it's greater than 30%. So if you believe something is greater than 30%, but it's actually 28%, are you right or wrong? Just say right or wrong instead. Don't even worry about errors. You believe, because you rejected the null, you think that the truth is the proportion is greater than 30%. But the truth is actually 28%. Are you right or wrong? So you believe, I think it's greater than 30%. I have evidence of that, but it's actually 28%. I believe it's greater than 30% now. I have evidence it's greater than 30%. It's actually 28%. So you're very what? You're like, I have evidence that the true proportion is greater than 30%. You're wrong. And you rejected the null. So because you rejected the null and you're wrong, you made a type 1 error. What? Oh, it's not, literally. But they rejected, I didn't see this one up here. They rejected the null. It's not greater than, oh my gosh. That wording right there. We got to get one wrong, right? We got to get one wrong. That's almost just not fair on the way they worded that. It's not greater than 30%, but they rejected. Yeah, it's true. It's not great. I mean, it is close to. That's such mean wording. Email me if you got that one wrong right there. That's ridiculous. It's type 1 error. We know that. They shouldn't have rejected the null. It's actually less than. A student tests 100 students to see if they like a brand of soda. They found no evidence. If they found no evidence, did they reject the null or not reject the null? If they found no evidence, did they reject the null or not reject the null? If they didn't find evidence, does that mean they rejected the null or didn't? What requires evidence? So they found no evidence. That tells you if they rejected the null or not rejected the null. The alternative is the evidence-based claim. They did not reject the null. So the only type of error they could have made right now is a what? So we're figuring it out because we can narrow it down to 3 choices. The only type of error they could have possibly made here is a what? So the only type of error they could have possibly made here is what? So they failed to reject the null. Boom, type 2. Since they failed to reject the null, the only thing they could have made as an error is they failed to reject the false null. So did they make the right choice? Because later all students were tested and there was no difference found. So they found no difference, and then all students were tested and found no difference. Was an error made? So they found no difference between the students in their test, and then later all students were tested and no difference was found. So what do you think? These are really good practice questions on it. So no error was made, right? So they did not make an error because no difference was found. Good job. Yeah, there's no error made. A human resource company believes that applicants score higher on placements tests than 50, like they score higher than the. She samples 50 and she signs 54.1. She fails to reject the null. So she didn't reject the null. Since she failed to reject the null, the only error she can make, say it with me again, if you fail to reject the null, the only error you can make is a what? If you fail to reject the null, the only possible error is a what? Type 2. Great job, Andrew. And then it's found that the average is 55.3, and she was looking for evidence it's greater than 52. Evidence it's greater than 52.5. So did she make an error? It's later found that it is greater than 55. It is greater than 52.5. So did she make an error? Yes or no? Did she make an error? We got only one more of this. Did she make an error? So she was trying to see if it's greater than 52.5. She said, I didn't find evidence. And then turns out it is greater. So that's a type 2 error. So yeah, there we go. If you see it right there in the background, she made a type 2 error. This was this. She should have rejected the null. She should have found evidence. She did make an error because turns out it was greater. So when you fail to reject the false null, it's because the value was actually higher than what it was for that one. I'm getting random calls from Benton, Tennessee, multiple days in a row. A pharmacy company tests whether a drug lifts headaches from the 25% rate normally seen. They fail to reject the null with a high p-value. The only error, I know we said it a lot, if they fail to reject the null, the only possible error is what? If you fail to reject the null, the only possible error is that the null was false and you should have rejected it. Because if the null is false, you should reject it. And so failing to reject the false null is what? Failing to reject the false null is what? Did they finally leave a voicemail for me? They need to leave voicemails, whoever that is calling me. Failing to reject the false null, the only error you can make, I know we said a lot today, is a what? Type 2. In a type 2 error, we fail to reject the false null. So in a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. In a type 2 error, the null is false and we fail to reject it. So if you fail to reject the null, remember the F for the type 2 right here, So we've made possibly a type 2 error. Do you think we've made one? I'm not going to read the end of it to you. Yes or no, do you think we made an error here? I'll let you read the end. I want you to tell me yes or no, do you think we made an error? Just yes, we made an error. No, we made an error. Which we know, failing to reject the null. What does it mean? Do we make an error if we found out this afterwards? Yes, we made an error. No, we did not make an error. Further testing shows that the drug actually relieves headaches at 38%. The null was that it has a 25% relief rate, and we didn't reject the null. We failed to reject it. So yes, we made an error. No, we didn't. Let me throw you some points. Keep those answers coming. So yes, we made an error. No, we didn't. Don't worry about being wrong. Yes, we made an error. No, we didn't. What do you think? I'll give it a few more seconds here. We did make an error. We did. The reason we did make an error is we believed to start that the headache relief was what? We believed it was 25%. And then, whoops, I'm blocking that. We believed it was 25%, and we didn't reject that. The truth is that it's 38%. So the null is false. The null is false, and we failed to reject it. The null is false, and we failed to reject it. Type 2 error. The null is false, and we failed to reject it. So the company made a type 2 error. The null was not rejected. Wait, no. It's that wording, but with type 2. The company made a type 2 error. The null was false. The null was not rejected, but it's false. And the true relief rate was greater than this. What was the null? The null was right here. They test whether the headache relief rate was higher. They're trying to see if it's 25% or higher. So if we wrote this out with classical stats, we'd write it the following way. The proportion of people who receive headache relief is 25%. The alternative hypothesis is the proportion of people who receive headache relief is greater than. So think of this, the null was false, but we failed to reject it. So the null is false and we failed to reject it. It's the alternative should have been shown evidence for. We just didn't get data that aligned with it. It can happen. Last one. So originally you said that. So the original belief is that the medicine only has a 25% headache relief. And then we said, okay, well, looks like that's what it is. We didn't find evidence for the truth, but then they found out, well, we failed to find out it works better. It's somehow, yes, this is really confusing. Like, it's like somehow you know the truth, because this is the hardest part, I think, of those questions, Balin. You bring up some really good points. Let me throw 5,000 points. You probably never find out the truth. A lot of people, like, imagine this. Imagine you go to the doctor and they say you have the flu, and they give you some medicine. You take the medicine and feel better. Turns out you never had the flu, you just had allergies. Do you think you really find out that you just had allergies? Like, you're feeling all down the dumps, and you start taking the medicine, 3-4 days, you start feeling better. You're like, man, I got over the flu. But it was actually just a type 1 error, false positive, but you took flu medicine. It happens. But, like, do we ever find out the type 1 error? Do we ever know that we're like, oh, that time you thought you had the flu 10 years ago and you took medicine, turns out you didn't have the flu. Turns out it was just seasonal allergies being really bad, and you were just really, congested from seasonal allergies, and your body was just overreacting to, stimulus. So a lot of times when you make errors, and that's what the question is very hard to understand, because you don't usually find out type 1, type 2 errors. You could find them out. Imagine like a baseball team is trying to draft a player, and they want to think, is this player a good player to draft? And they need evidence the player is a good player. How might the team find out they had a false negative? Like, that would mean the team didn't draft the player. How would the team eventually find out they had a false negative? They had the opportunity to get this player, and they say, no, we don't have enough evidence to draft this player. We're going to let them go on. When might the team find out later on down the road that they made a type 2 error because they should have drafted the player? How would the team find that out eventually, maybe, possibly? He's good later, exactly. So what would a type 1 error be for the team? So the team's trying to draft players. How would a team find out they made a type 1 error? Because they're figuring out, should I draft this player? What would a type 1 error be for a team? What would a type 1 error be for a team? Because they're trying to figure out, should I draft this player? Exactly. You draft a player and then they're just like a dud and you're like, oh, we made the wrong choice because we said we had evidence to draft the player. So you just start, like it's like some of these get into the NFL or something, they're just throwing interceptions left and right and you're like, why would did we do this? And you're like, we made the wrong choice. So you said you had evidence, because null hypothesis would be in this example. This is just theoretical examples. Null hypothesis is don't draft. Alternative hypothesis is draft. And if you think about this, this means you need evidence to draft a player. Like you would need evidence they're a good player. So in a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. So the null is true in a type 1 error, but we reject the null. So it's true that we shouldn't draft them. And we wouldn't know that in the moment that we shouldn't draft them. You say, well, why would you reject the null if the null, the null is true? The null is the belief that we start out with until evidence otherwise. You're saying, like, I'm not going to draft every player. I'm going to need evidence to draft players. So if you ask me, hey, should we draft this player? I say, not until you give me a reason. I'm not going to draft players by default. The null is the default belief. So someone walks into the doctor's office, you'd probably believe what about their health? They just walk in, you haven't even looked at them. They say, you have an appointment today with so-and-so. And you don't, know nothing about them. You know nothing. Just, you have an appointment today without any evidence. And of course you could reverse it if like the person's coming in for checkups and things like that. Like I need to find evidence of this, like evidence, certain things. But you would try to find evidence of sickness. Like you would give them tests and things like that to reject the null and say, yes, we believe you're sick. This is the evidence you're sick. So does that make sense? Like the null is what is believed by default. It can be pretty much any default you want, but it's the belief you have that does not require evidence. The null requires no evidence. The null is rejected when there's evidence for the alternative. Does that make sense? When you have evidence someone is sick, you reject the null. With the baseball players, we don't just draft every player. What we do is we don't draft players, and then we draft the players we have evidence to draft for. And then, like, think about this. If we have a baseball player and they hit, when they go to bat, and we have them practice in the majors, this is a baseball player, and let's say 10% of the time they're hitting home runs, and 30% of the time they're getting on base, and we've watched them play, and we're like, we have the opportunity to get this player. Would this be a likely result for a player we shouldn't draft or an unlikely result? So we think about, so now it's like p-values again, right? So if you think about this, if this player is knocking balls out of the park all the time and they're doing it against real major league players, like we were testing them, we throw them in the, like, we were like, hey, we need you to practice against these people, and they're just crushing balls, and we're like, yeah, this is not something we would expect from a player we wouldn't draft. So you would say you reject the null. And when you reject, it's an unlikely result, you would reject the null. So this is a very unlikely thing to see. So from the pool of non-draftable players, this would be an unlikely thing to see. If they're truly an undraftable player, if there's someone we shouldn't draft, this is very unlikely to see. Low p-value, reject the null. And it's always possible that maybe someone said we only watched 10 at-bats. Imagine sample size, right? So if someone said this only came from a sample of 10 at-bats, I probably wouldn't trust it that much. I'd be like, wait, so you're telling me they hit one home run and they got on base 3 other times or something? Like you tell them your sample size was 10, so then you could make an error, right? Like that's more likely to make errors, more likely to make a type 2 error. And then if someone says, no, it was at 1,000 at-bats, I'd say, okay, that's pretty trustworthy. Less likely we'll make a type 2 error there. Because type 2 error is when you fail to reject the false null. And could we just talk about an error? Yeah. A lot of different errors. But if you see how this all converges, like you'd watch them do more at bats to get a better understanding, make less errors. You'd have a more powerful test to figure out if you should draft the player or not draft the player. Well, really good work. Last question, nice and easy. Just say 1 or 2 in the chat. What type of error is made when the null is true and it's rejected? 1 or 2. Please be nice to me. So the null is true and it's rejected. I'm going to go grab a drink. You got it, Bailey. You got it. In a type 1 error, the null is true and we reject it. In a type 2 error, the null is false and we fail to reject it. Those are literally on the test, and it's your alpha rate. Nice job with that. Full homework should be done. Have you tried Winter Edition? Oh, is that the plum one or what is it? I might go get that. Maybe I'll do that. We're off Monster. Monster's not sponsoring us. We're Red Bull all the time here. I might go grab a Winter Edition Red Bull. It's vanilla berry. If that's available, I'm going to get it. Check out Vanilla Berry Red Bull, new favorite. I'm trying it. See you later on. Bye, Vanilla Berry Red Bull.